Okay. Welcome. My name is Piper Chapman, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Harvard Alumni Travels. Thank you for joining us today for our inaugural Travel Talks lecture series. Over the course of the pandemic, you might imagine that our work has shifted quite a bit. While we enthusiastically await the return of travel, we wanted to be able to carry out our mission of educational engagement for Harvard alumni, friends, and family. This led us to develop the Travel Talks lecture series, which features some of our favorite study leaders who, like us, find themselves at home, working, learning, and teaching in these unusual times. Look out for future travel talks in our monthly emails. We hope you'll join us for more interactive and engaging conversations with some of Harvard's finest faculty. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If we were out traveling on a Harvard travel trip, we usually refer to these as the rules of the road. So, in the spirit of travel, let's begin here. You might notice that we have gathered today by using our Zoom webinar platform. Your microphone will be muted and your video will be turned off so we can direct our attention to our speaker. However, we love for this talk to be as engaging as possible, so the chat feature at the bottom of your webinar screen will be on and accessible throughout the lecture. Please feel free to include your comments and thoughts in the chat box and your questions in the Q&A box. Some of your questions will be addressed at the end of our lecture, time permitting. Additionally, if you have any technical issues, you can also use the chat and one of our team members will try to assist you. Our webinar, which will be recorded, will last 1 hour, including time for Q&A. Finally, at the conclusion of our program, a very brief 2-minute survey will pop up on your computer screen. We'd be grateful if you would take the time to complete this survey, as it will be instrumental in developing future travel talks. To kick off our talk, I invite all of you to enter your location in the chat so we can see where we're all tuning in from. Let's take a look. Great, thank you. Now, to our lecturer who graciously offered to host our first travel talk. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jim Salzman, the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Visiting Professor of Law at Harvard University. I am sure you've had the opportunity to review Jim's impressive bio and his affiliations and appointments at Harvard, Yale, Duke, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, and others. He was twice voted Professor of the Year by his students at Duke. Jim's vital work on environmental law and policy continues to receive international attention by governments. His new book, Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives, will be published by Doubleday next March. I thought I would take a moment to share a more personal token of my appreciation and admiration of Jim. While I have plenty of stories I could share with you, since Jim, his wife Heather, and I traveled together in Japan a few years ago, I'd rather share this bit of information that reflects Jim's true colors. Some of you might know that Jim and Heather live in the sunny, warm state of California. For reasons that are still unknown to us, Jim makes the trek all the way to Cambridge, Massachusetts, each snowy and cold January to teach his J-term course at Harvard Law School. Snow boots and winter hat in tow, Jim makes it a point to swing by our office to chat over coffee each year. And for this, we are grateful for his dedication to Harvard. Thank you, Jim. So let's turn things over to Jim to start his lecture titled, Our Place in the World, The Histories of Maps.
Thank you, Piper. And let's see, is this working?
Yes.
Yes. All right. So everything's downhill from here. Thank you for this. And I have to say at the outset, Harvard really is a special place in my heart. Apart from going to school there, my dad was on the faculty of the medical school for his entire career, and my mom still lives just a stone's throw, well, a long stone's throw from the square. So I admit it, I have always loved maps. I love the challenge of using them to get around. I love the thrill of planning trips. I love just daydreaming with them. And I think once you start looking, it's hard not to see maps really everywhere. Today's presentation, as Piper mentioned, comes from my service as a study leader on a number of alumni trips. Now, everyone who takes these trips, almost by definition, is curious about travel. And if you're curious about travel, you're curious about maps. And so I developed this lecture to feed that curiosity. This is the most recent group that was in Antarctica. And I want to give a special shout out. I know that a bunch of former travelers from various trips are online today. So hi all. So I developed this presentation to share. And for the next 45 minutes, I want to share with you how I've come to understand and think about maps. And I hope to persuade you to think about them differently than before as well. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I want to make clear at the outset, my scholarship is in the environmental field, environmental law and policy. It's not cartography. My focus today, though, is not the history of science or the science of map making. Rather, what I want to do is to explore with you the history of the uses of maps and the meanings of maps and how these have changed over time. So I want to start with a basic premise. And the basic premise is that humans have always sought to answer a very basic question. And the question is, how do we fit in the world? And we use maps to show us, and we likely always have done so. I want to argue that today, though, we are actually more dependent on maps than ever before. And to show why, I want to start with a personal story, because being dependent on map has its downsides. And the downside is that many of us have stopped paying attention to the world around us because we're focused too much on maps. So I want to start then with a personal story. About 6-7 years ago, I was teaching at Vermont Law School, a summer course. And Heather and I had dinner with some friends, and we were driving back. It was a little rainy, and I was following the GPS to get back to the cabin we were staying in. And the GPS had us go and go onto a dirt road. And for those of you who've been in Vermont, that's not a big deal. Many of the roads in Vermont are dirt roads. But the roads started getting more pitted, a little muddy, a little overgrowth. And Heather, who actually had lived in Vermont, said, "Do you really think this is a good idea?" I said, "Not a problem, not a problem. Just keep following the GPS. You know where this is going, right?" So we go over a crest, down the hill, and all of a sudden I find myself stuck in this mud quagmire, surrounded by this verdant growth with water dripping everywhere. And frankly, I half expected to see this in our window. Now, Heather, to her credit, had the self-control not immediately to tell me what an idiot I was. And instead, she said, "I think it's best if I not say anything." Now, this provided an opportunity for some quiet time for the next 2 hours as we waited for the tow truck to arrive. And in the silence, one of the things I was thinking was, why did I allow the GPS to turn off my brain? Right? Why did I not think beyond the map? Because it didn't used to be this way. We can all relate to some version of this. Now, in my defense, which I admit is limited, it's not just me. So I started doing some web research, and I found some partners in stupidity. So a 23-year-old woman was driving her car through the Ontario town of Tobermory. This is unfamiliar territory for her, so she was dutifully following her GPS, and she drove down a boat launch and straight into the frigid waters. Thankfully, there's a happy ending. She managed to climb out of her car and swim to shore as her bright red Yaris sank beneath the waves. This 67-year-old Belgian was led remarkably astray by her GPS. She was supposed to be on a short drive from Brussels into Germany until she noticed several hours later the signs were in Croatian. This next incident in San Francisco, I think, speaks for itself. Wow, and it was Uber. My favorite, though, was in Switzerland. So Robert Ziegler was a Swiss delivery driver who was following his GPS, and the road he was on turned into a goat track. And he followed this goat track until he became completely stuck. And so the question is, what do you do? He couldn't back out. He couldn't get out of his car door. This is a true story. He needed an airlift from a helicopter back to the main road. And so the way I figure it, Vermont could have been much, much worse, much worse. And I'm sure we all have our map stories, perhaps not quite as embarrassing. So I want to offer 4 take-home messages from today's lecture. The first is every map has a purpose. It may be practically to get from point A to point B. It may be more broadly to locate your place physically and metaphysically. But map makers make their maps for a reason. They may be artistic or beautiful, and they often are, but they're designed for a specific purpose. Second of all, every map tells a story. Maps can be drawn a lot of different ways. So you want to ask yourself, why was the map drawn this way? Usually it's implicit. Every map lies, right? No map is ever truly accurate. So you want to ask, why is it inaccurate in this particular setting? And finally, these each change over time. In fact, the purpose of maps has changed dramatically over the last 2,500 years, from primarily cosmological and symbolic to deeply practical and political. In fact, we're using more maps in more different ways than ever before, from mapping the reaches of the universe all the way down to the human genome. And these maps all reflect how our vision of ourselves relative to the world has changed. Now, we're most familiar in the US with the Mercator map. And I want to use the chat box for a sec. So what story is this Mercator map telling us? What does this tell us about the world? Well, there we go. Aridity, it's flat. Okay. Let's think about this for a sec. What does it tell us about Antarctica, right? It tells us that Antarctica doesn't make sense. This is a Eurocentric map. The big countries, the important countries are on top of the map, the top half of the map. They're in the middle. The Europe and US seem pretty big. Turns out, though, that when you actually look at their actual size, the Mercator map is extremely distorted. But this is inescapable. And it's inescapable because the most accurate map of the world isn't feasible, right? The most accurate map of the world is the world itself. Obviously, you can't carry that in your back pocket. The fundamental challenge we have is that maps are 2D, but the world is 3D. And so every map is a projection. It necessarily distorts how we see the world. So for the Mercator map, countries that are close to the poles, like Canada and Russia, are artificially enlarged. Countries at the equator, like Africa, shrink. Now, I should make clear there are scores of different projection techniques. There's not just Mercator. There's orthographic, mnemonic, azimuthal, stereographic, and many others. In 1973, the left-wing German historian Arno Peters provided what became quite a famous or notorious alternative to the Mercator. It was known as the Peters projection. He also called it the equal area projection. So Peters claimed that it depicted countries and continents according to their actual surface area. And through this, the northern continent shrank, while Africa and South America appeared much larger and much longer. But critics, of course, argue that Peters had introduced new distortions. But let's consider a more fundamental question than the relative size of the continents. How we orient the map tells a story. So on this map, where is the center of the world? Right? You're darn right, right? It's the US. So we're familiar with the US being in the center of things, but this is not the case when you're traveling in Russia. So this is a very cool map. This is a Soviet map, world map from 1928. And this tells a very different story, no? In this map, the USSR dominates the world. The US is sort of off to the side, small in comparison. But this begs an even more fundamental question, and take a breath before you see this next slide, right? Why the north-south orientation, all right? When I first, I would let this sink in for a moment. When I first saw this map, it freaked me out. It took me a while to actually find where New York is. This map is no less accurate, but it tells a very different story. And there's no reason this isn't the standard map. In fact, if you lived in Australia, you'd love for this to be the standard map. Nor does the map have to be focused on the equator. In the Arctic, Russia is clearly the most important nation, and framing the world this way makes clear the politics on top of the world. Now, we are used to thinking that history shapes maps, and what I want to suggest is that it works both ways, and maps can shape history. And one of the best examples of this in real time is this. So does anyone know what this is? It looks like a table tent. Anyone know where this picture was taken? That's right. This map, actually, this is the bottom of the North Pole. So about 8-10 years ago, a Russian sub placed this titanium table tent, who knows how big it is, on the ocean floor. And it was kind of a Russian informal claim to the Arctic waters. Now that climate change has made the Northwest Passage a reality, they're redrawing lines, literally national jurisdictional lines, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But maps, of course, go far beyond simple geography. We can use the power of visual representation to show complicated events. So this is a very famous 1869 map of Napoleon's Russian campaign. It was by Charles Joseph Menard. It's regarded by map experts as the greatest ever statistical map. So how does it work? Essentially, it combines the number of troops, the date, the location of battles, and where the troops were moving. On the bottom line, it shows the temperature on the return trip. And essentially, you can see very clearly that Napoleon started with 422,000 troops. By the time he got to Moscow, he had 100,000. And by the time he returned back to Paris, and you can see the temperature dropping from so-called general frost, he only had 10,000. So this is all by way of introduction. To truly tell the story of maps and to start, we need to ask about the oldest maps of all, about how maps work in nature. So salmon, caribou, geese, monarch butterflies, they all migrate long distances. How? Do they have innate maps? Now, there's no single strategy for how they know where to go. My favorite study was an ingenious experiment done in 1969 in Cornell, actually in the Cornell Planetarium by Steve Emlin with indigo buntings. And what he did is he used the planetarium to shift where the North Star was. And he had a metal shield over the bird cage to block out the Earth's magnetic field. So the bunting basically stood on an ink pad surrounded by a bundle of blotting paper. And what they found was the birds always followed the North Star. There was some kind of internal map guided by celestial navigation, and this was passed on hardwired every generation in their genes. Much, much more recently, we start the tale of human maps. So this is the oldest human map we have found. It is a clay tablet. It's circular. Babylon is in the center. It's bisected by the Euphrates River and surrounded by the ocean. A few regions are named, including Assyria. Ironically, it's about the size and the shape of an iPhone. Now, this wasn't for navigation, obviously. It was far more basic. This allowed the map holder to grasp the idea of himself or herself at the very center, holding the world in their hands. The first great attempt in the West to make mapping accurate starts in the 2nd century with Claudius Ptolemy. So he was an astrologer, and I actually didn't know much about astrology, apart from newspaper astrology until I started looking into this. But if you're going to make an accurate horoscope, it requires a few things: the precise date, the precise time, and precisely where the person was born. So Ptolemy started gathering documents detailing the relative locations of towns. He devised a system of lines of latitude and longitude to flatten the planet. He knew it was round. He augmented that information with tales of travelers and plotted locations, and he called this new technique geography. After the Roman Empire fell, Ptolemy's realistic geography was lost to the West for almost 1,000 years. And so instead, we have a different kind of map that emerges in the West. This is typical. It's called the TO map. This is from the 7th century. Obviously, it's not of practical purpose. It identifies the 3 known continents as populated by the descendants of Noah. So you've got Sem, Asia on top. You've got Ham, Africa on the right, and Yaphet, Europe on the left, surrounded by the Mediterranean. Notice that the east is on top. Now, obviously, these are unrelated. The map makers in the 7th century didn't know about the Babylonian tablet, but it is interesting how much they resemble one another. With the fall of Rome, the focus of map making accuracy shifts to the Muslim world. About 800 to 1400 AD, they conquered much of the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and that empire was an intellectual hotspot. It's where we get algebra from. This is the 12th century map made by Islamic scholar Al-Sharif al-Idrisi. He was commissioned by his protector, King Roger of Sicily, which he nicely placed in the center of the map. Al-Idrisi puts, if you can figure this out, on this map, south is on the top, and Africa is this crescent-shaped landmass. Unlike Ptolemy, Al-Idrisi depicted a circumnavigable Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, upside down from what we're used to, is in the center. Now, this map is concerned with representing physical geography. The land masses are pretty recognizable. There are no monsters on these maps. That was not the same for what was happening in medieval map making in Europe. They took a very, very different turn, and they developed what became known as allegorical maps. And these essentially depicted what the universe would look like to medieval Christians. And the organizing principle in this East-oriented map is the biblical world, not the human world. Now, the most famous of these was made in Hereford, England. It's 5 feet by 4 feet. It's big. It's on a single animal skin. And if you look at this, very little of Europe, Asia, or North Africa is recognizable. So this is an easier version to read, this representation. And on this map, all of history is happening at the very same time. So Christ is at the very top of the map. He's looming over the globe. The top of the map, as I said, faces east, the holiest direction. And the viewer travels spiritually from the Garden of Eden at the top. And if we, you can see this after the lecture for a blow up, Adam and Eve actually on this map are being thrown out of the Garden of Eden. At the bottom are the Pillars of Hercules near the Straits of Gibraltar. And at the center, marked with an X, is Jerusalem. And to the right is Africa. This is a very intricate map. There are 1,100 place names with commentary, and there are strange wonders that run amok. So this is a lynx that is strutting across Asia Minor and written in Latin, as you can see. The lynx sees through walls and urinates a black stone. If you want to find Noah's Ark, you are in luck. It turns out Noah's Ark is in Armenia, just above the four-legged king. And God knows what's going on here in this region that is populated by people with eyes and mouths in their shoulders. So you look at this and there are more strange wonders aplenty, and you say, what the heck is going on, right? How could this map make any sense at all? Was the map maker on acid chewing mushrooms? What's going on here? And the way to answer this is to think about the map's purpose. In the Middle Ages, very few people needed accurate maps of the world. Except for mariners, generals, tax collectors, and pilgrims, people didn't really need maps because they rarely left their villages or went beyond the market town. This map was much more important as a narrative of the world. This map was not intended to get you from town to town. It was designed to guide you to heaven. So what about pilgrims who really did need accurate maps? So this is a 13th century pilgrimage map, and it shows the route from one place to another as a straight line, and there are major waypoints and landmarks along the way. So I want to ask you if you can type into your chat box, does this remind you of anything? And I think you have to be over 50 to be able to answer this correctly. Exactly. This is the triptych, right? I remember when we were young, when I was young, we would get these from AAA just before we left on our trips, and you could basically follow all along the way and see and talk about the sites as they were coming. This was not a new idea, right? This goes back about 1,000 years. Now, maps, of course, were not just developed in the West. Every major civilization has developed maps. Interestingly, much of the early accurate map making focused on stars. So this is a map from China, and they had maps that located thousands and thousands of stars. This is an ancient map of the Indus River in ancient India. This is an Aztec map. Here they mix a geographic layout of the city with also showing the types of activities that are happening in the planned city. This is from Korea. This was designed by a team of royal astronomers. China is a gigantic mass at the center of the map. Korea is actually disproportionately large. It's to its right. The island of Japan is in the bottom right. Africa is circumnavigable. You can see the Arabian Peninsula just next to Africa. And this tiny, tiny, insignificant blob, barbaric blob, in the upper left is Europe, right? And this was sort of their view of the world in the 1400s. As the Renaissance dawned, maps began to improve. Commerce demanded it. Kings engaged in empire building needed to chart their lines. So this was a type of map that was developed. It was called a Portolan map, and reliable compasses help you create basically these you could follow these crisscrossing lines from port to port and help guide sailors. It basically showed all 32 directions on a mariner's compass. This is only useful though when you are in sight of land. And the Portolan maps are the first maps to develop a convention of orientation toward the north, in the west, that is to say. Ptolemy's ancient work, though, was rediscovered, and new maps are drawn based on his 1,000-year-old calculations. And the goal is to make maps accurate based on data, right? The Mappe Mundi, the Hereford maps, the allegorical maps, those are behind. Those are now seen as cosmological maps. And these maps actually, based on Ptolemy's data, could be very accurate. So this is from the Prima Europa Tabula, 1482. Ptolemy's Guide to Geography was published. Europe is very easily recognizable. This is the United Kingdom. It's very accurate, right? But maps outside of Europe were largely guesswork. Christopher Columbus and his brother actually ran a map business in Lisbon, and they combined a series of charts and reports to plan Columbus's voyage. This sort of explains some of his mistakes. He was convinced he was in India, right? That's why he called his discovery the Indies. But the real stimulus for Europe to map the New World came from maritime discoveries and trade. The voyages of Ferdinand Magellan, Vasco da Gama, many others opened the entire world to European ships and trade. And globalization was even more profound than today, with the realization that nowhere actually was somewhere. And this created a whole new work and really profession for map makers, because maps became critical to power and to wealth. So this is one of the most famous early maps. This is by Martin Waldseemüller. It's 12 woodcuts that were put together, and it incorporates the latest discoveries by the European explorers. And you get the sense that the woodcutter was asked at the very last minute to make room for this discovery of this Cape of Good Hope that people just learned about. So forget the margin, we're gonna add that in. This is the very first map to recognize the Pacific Ocean and the separate continent of America that he named in honor of Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci had traveled there in 1503 and realized this was not the Indies, this was the New World. The Library of Congress actually bought this from a German prince for $10 million. At the time, it was the most expensive map in the world, and it's been called America's birth certificate. So how did the map makers, cartographers, how did they make these maps for areas outside of Europe? Well, they relied on reports from voyages. And just as one example of the problems this could lead to, an early Spanish explorer reported that California was surrounded by water on all sides. And this was enshrined by an Amsterdam mapmaker, Michael Collin, in 1622. And California was actually drawn as an island well into the 18th century. The story starts moving forward fast, though, in terms of the modern maps we're used to today, with Gerodes Mercator, who in 1569 unveils the single greatest innovation in mapping after Ptolemy. And this becomes known as the Mercator Projection. Now, Mercator was equally skilled in engraving and in mathematics. And he basically represented the surface of the globe on a map by gradually widening the land masses and oceans the farther north and south that appear on the map. But this was the real insight. The insight was you could follow compass courses on the map, and they would be accurate on the ocean and land. So this was the very first map that permitted navigators to draw their route as a compass straight line. This is the Mercator Projection in 1569. It's the first world map using the Mercator Projection on 21 separate sheets of paper. And this is really when you get an era that's really the explosion of maps. And they're used explicitly instrumentally for all kinds of purposes. Commerce obviously was an important one. As sea trade increased, the maps of the New World became better, but only for the economically important areas. Sea coast and the major rivers, beaver trade, timber. This is the French map from 1650. And the inland of America is mostly a mystery, right? The map makers just drew it as a big blank space. They didn't bother to make things up. Now, obviously, for accuracy, that's better than links that urinates black stones, but it shows you what the map makers cared about here, the story they were telling. By the late 17th century, joint stock companies are mapping every corner of the world, and anonymous teams of people are crunching data and producing maps. This is data made visual for profit and for power. We think of the current era as data crunching huge amounts of information. It was even more so in the age of exploration, when the phrase the known world really meant something. Maps in the military. Sea power in that era was everything, and there was competition among all the nation's navies. And in fact, many of the most famous sea voyages were for mapping. Captain Cook, William Bligh, Darwin's voyage of the Beagle. And maps were so valuable that seafarers plundered them. This is a great example of that. This is a journal of a 17th century English buccaneer named Bartholomew Sharp, and he wrote his autobiography. And when he captured a Spanish ship, he exulted over his cartographic haul. So this is what he wrote. He said, "In this prize, I took a Spanish manuscript of prodigious value. It describes all the ports, harbors, bays, sands, rock, and rising of the land. They were going to throw it overboard, but by good luck I saved it. The Spanish cried when I got the book. As part of military and obviously navigation, even if you've got a map, you need to know where you are on the map. Now, latitude is easy to find with an astrolabe. Just locate the North Star Polaris at night and measure the angle. Longitude is much more difficult. And to figure out longitude, you needed to figure out an accurate way to keep time on the voyages. And once you had the time where you were and the time at somewhere else, say Greenwich, then you could calculate what the longitude would be. So everyone understood how to calculate longitude. The problem is no one could do it. And the consequences could be disastrous. At this time, navigators relied on dead reckoning. And this was inaccurate on long voyages out of sight of land, when there was a storm, and it ended, as I said, in terrible tragedy. So the Scilly naval disaster in 1707, the British Royal Navy lost 4 warships. It was one of the worst disasters in the history of the Royal Navy. There was an increasing urgency to identify longitude, so Parliament passes a law. And basically, they offer a prize, £20,000 for someone who can figure out how to discover longitude on board ships. Similar prizes had been offered by France and Spain and Holland, and the very best scientists of the time, including Isaac Newton, thought that this was impossible. Well, John Harrison didn't think so. He spent 4 decades perfecting a watch that would earn him compensation. And he designed this incredibly complex chronometer, and ships would travel with multiple chronometers and average them. It was brilliant engineering. He constructed different metals to counteract the expansion and shrinkage of the metal during the trip. And if you're interested in this story, I can recommend a fabulous book by Davis Sobel called Longitude. There's actually a Harvard angle to this as well. Her most recent book is about women who worked in the Harvard Observatory, Astronomical Observatory, in the 19th century. Nation building. Anyone recognize this map? This is a tough one, but let's see if we got anyone out here. Nope, okay. This is from the Lewis and Clark expedition. All right, so Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase, he knew the country had purchased a huge amount of land, but no one really knew what was there. Lewis and Clark's main goal was to map it and basically come back and tell the government, this is what you have. And what about public health? It turns out that maps are critically important here. Now, obviously, any settled society has to have a reliable source of drinking water, but the water also has to be safe to drink. And how do you know the water is safe to drink? Well, your judgment depends basically on what you think causes disease. In the medieval Europe, really through 19th century, well into the 19th century, the dominant theory was called the miasmatic theory. And the idea was that these miasma, these poisonous airs, were what caused disease. Malaria, the mosquito-borne disease, that literally means bad airs. At the time, cholera was the scourge of Europe. It routinely would kill thousands, tens of thousands of people, and no one knew what caused cholera. They assumed it was airborne. There was a guy, though, called John Snow, who had his own theory. And he believed that cholera was a waterborne disease, and people thought that he was crazy. The Lancet, the leading medical journal, wrote an editorial actually denouncing him. But he couldn't figure out how to sort of prove this was happening, but he got lucky. In 1854, there was an outbreak of cholera in Soho, in London. It was terrifying. 10% of the local population died in the first 3 days. A law had been passed about 15 years earlier that required when someone died, there had to be a public record of their age, name, cause of death, and address. And prior to that, it really had been like Monty Python's Bring Out Your Dead. So Snow went to the public records, and he basically got all the names and addresses of the victims who had died in the first week. And what he did was he plotted these on a map. This is the very first time this has ever been done. It's a very famous map in the history of science. It's called the Ghost Map. And what Snow showed was that all of the cholera cases were centered around the Broad Street pump, right in the middle of Soho. The map actually showed some other things that were very interesting as well. So the brewery next door, no one had died of cholera. It was right next door. There was a workhouse that had 530 inmates just around the corner. Only 5 people contracted cholera. Why so few? Well, Snow looked into it and he realized at the Broad Street Brewery, there were 70 workers. No one died because they were given an allowance of free beer every day. They never drank water at all. And in the workhouse, they had their own well. And this is literally the birth of epidemiology, the birth of public health as a discipline. And we see the consequences of this, or the result of this today with the COVID maps that we're seeing on the news all the time. You start to see maps used for public policy more generally as you get farther into the 1800s. So Charles Booth developed what were known as the poverty maps. And he used mapping to identify demographics. And he found that extreme poverty was clustered by railway yards and by canals. He would basically mark the different demographic groups on these maps with different colors. This was a novel theory that where we live shapes how we behave. He could show gentrification as it was happening. He could show a community becoming poorer as it was happening. Now, this led to a lot of good in city planning, but it represented a moral judgment based on address, and it ended up leading to a lot of bad as well. And in the United States, we saw this 4 decades later in the practice known as redlining. So the Federal Housing Administration was a New Deal agency established in 1934. It would formally grade neighborhoods into 4 categories, and neighborhoods with high minority occupants were marked in red. And they were marked in red because they were considered high-risk mortgage. They were considered high-risk loans for mortgage lenders. And the mortgage lenders effectively refused to insure mortgages in and near primarily African-American neighborhoods. So this is a red line map of Boston. And you see here, this yellow dot is Harvard Square. And you can see minority neighborhoods from that era nearby. And I think there's no question that this federally endorsed segregation had enormous impacts that ripple through today, and I think arguably echo in the Black Lives Matter protests that we're seeing on the streets. I want to turn now, though, to the more creative stories of maps. And the best place to start is the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer. So he's been described by art historians ever since he was discovered as having a, quote, mania for maps. And many of his masterpieces actually feature maps. Now, this wasn't a coincidence. The golden age of the Netherlands, when Vermeer was painting, its golden era arose from its international trade, and maps symbolized its commercial dominance. They took on an ornamental role on walls and in paintings. And what's fascinating is that Vermeer didn't simply have a map that he used as the same backdrop. His maps featured different, his paintings featured different maps. So this one is a map of Holland and West Friesland. This one is a map of Europe. But maps can tell us not just more about our own world, but also about others that never existed. So does anyone recognize this? So this is a map from, no, not Peter Pan. It's a good guess though. Treasure Island, very good. This is a map from Treasure Island, which in fact drives the plot, right? Skeleton Island, where it's literally a treasure map. And Robert Louis Stevenson had wonderful advice to writers of fiction. He says, even with imaginary places, it's best to provide a map because relations will appear you hadn't thought about, and you'll discover obvious, unsuspected shortcuts. Even when a map is not at all the plot, or not all the plot, it'll be found to be a mine of suggestion. Okay, so here is one of the most famous early maps in literature. Can anyone recognize this one? All right, so this actually is from Thomas More's Utopia, 1516, about the same area. Dante had a map of the circles of hell in the Inferno as well. I think everyone's going to recognize this, right? This is an annotated map of Middle Earth by J.R. Tolkien. This is held in the library, the Bodleian at Oxford. But this is my all-time favorite. What is sweeter than 100 Acre Wood? It says, drawn by me, and Mr. Shepherd helped, in Eeyore's gloomy place. So obviously you find maps throughout literature, but you also find maps that many of us use as tourists. And this has always been a big market ever since you've had tourism. Since at least Roman times, likely earlier than that, we just don't have traces of them anymore. And the focus here is, yes, on accuracy, but the focus also is on making the maps as user-friendly as possible. So you may think the idea of 3D maps was developed recently. No, it dates from about 3 centuries ago, and probably earlier than that. Maps are especially important for rail travel. Now, the tradition had been that you basically superimpose railway lines on top of the real map. And that's okay. It's not super easy to read. And we owe a huge gratitude of debt to Harry Beck. This all changed thanks to this man. He had the insight that accuracy is less important than communication. And he developed what became known as a circuit diagram for the London Underground. This supposedly, I don't know how to prove this, but I've read in a number of places, this is the most printed map in the world. There are over 500 million copies of this map. And Beck's insight was the order of stops matters much more than the distance between them or the exact location. So where have we seen this before? Were you paying attention? Gonna give you 5 more seconds. No, not longitude. Pilgrimage maps, that's right. This is the same idea as the pilgrimage maps, the triptych, all right? And the focus is not whether you're going in a straight line or not. The focus is what are the key points of interest that you're going to see along the way. Maps have also played a central role in political propaganda. We tend to think of this as a patriotic poster, a patriotic flag. Yes, and it's a map, right? The tail to the head runs south to north, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, New England. They basically took a map, converted it into a snake to make a message that we have to hold together. In 1812, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, he redrew his electoral boundaries in Essex County because he wanted to change the distribution of voters to favor his party. And the new district, the magazine Illustrator thought, looked like a salamander. And so he created this image, and this basically led to the creation of the term known as a gerrymander. Right? This is the origin of the idea of gerrymandering, which we're talking about a lot about nowadays. But of course, maps also can be used to make even more political statements. In the late 19th century, particularly in Europe, maps were used in popular magazines to explain geopolitics in a dramatic fashion. So this, for example, was drawn in 1877 at the start of the Russo-Turkish War. It was drawn by an Englishman, and it portrays Great Britain as a brave soldier, John Bull. And we know who the villain is in this cartoon. It's Octopus. It's shown as a great glutton. And that was actually the name of the caption under the map. It's stretching out its tentacles to strangle not just Turkey, but Poland and Scandinavia. The same image is used not for Europe, though, but for Asia. So this was a Japanese adaptation of the same map used in 1904 during the Russo-Japanese War. Russian is still the octopus alien threat, but here it's strangling Persia, Tibet, and China. Let's fast forward, go back to Europe. The concern of this map is over the rising influence of Russia. So you can see Tsar Nicholas II sitting on top of Europe. He's holding on to Finland. He's stepping on Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. He's kicking Prussia. But of course, times change, and maybe Russia actually is our ally, which is what happened in the First World War. And here, instead of being this terrible threat, the Tsar is basically a powerful steamroller that is moving toward the yapping Dachshund of Germany and Austria, who are the big problems. They're about to crash through the Eastern Front. Now, none of these maps obviously were created by Russians, but many maps were for propaganda. It was known as agitprop, agitation through propaganda. So in this one, we see Comrade Lenin sweeping royalty and moneyed interests off the earth. It's a very common image of the globe to represent the worldwide revolution of the proletariat. The Nazis also made effective use of agitprop. This is a 1941 Nazi poster against Stalin. It says in German, Europe's victory is your prosperity. And maps were very common politically after the fall of the Iron Curtain to show the threat from the Soviets. So this, I think, is a very descriptive one showing what Stalin would like to do, what he's already controlled and what he'd like to control. This one is very clever as well. This uses a different perspective and it places the West at the top of the map. And I think it looks like the Soviets are rolling downhill into Western Europe. It makes Western Europe look especially vulnerable. But let's return for a second to the octopus image. And we can see how that's continued through time. So this is from 1938. Russia is still an octopus, but now it's basically Stalin's face, and it shows the global danger of Soviet communism. 1950 shows the global danger of the tentacles of communist China, Korea, Indochina, Tibet, Malaysia. But it's not just communism, right? 1960, The Dangers of American Capitalism. This was actually published by the French Communist Party. It says, no, France will not be a colonized country. We still see Russia returning as an octopus. This is 2008 with Vladimir Putin's aims for some of the former Soviet republics. Now, politics obviously can play out in maps in many different ways, and some of them unintentionally. So I want to end with a map that's not overtly political, but has become so. This is obviously the famous New Yorker cover by Saul Steinberg. And the humor of this cartoon lies in what merits mention on the map and what doesn't merit mention, obviously, at all. But this also sends a political message, and it has become fodder for critiques of how Northeastern elites view the world. This likely isn't so funny for those who live in so-called flyover states. Now, there is much, much more I could say, really fascinating stuff about the histories of maps and theft of maps and all. But I want to look ahead in the last few minutes before we turn to leave about 10 minutes for question and answer. And I want to talk about what do maps look like in the 21st century and going forward, because maps are now being reimagined for powerful, powerful data analysis. So I have a joint appointment to law school and School of the Environment here in the University of California. I did at Duke as well. GIS, Geographic Information Systems. These are not college majors, they're graduate programs. It's a required course if you go to environment school. It is key to water policy and managing drought. So how does GIS work? The basic idea is you get, each map represents a different layer of data. And you can basically combine them and get very interesting correlations that you wouldn't otherwise see. And get relationships. You can ask questions that you never thought to ask before. And you can do this yourself. Most of you who are watching, certainly in the States, if you go onto your county website, you will find a GIS app. And this will allow you to basically chart all kinds of things: easements, watersheds, zoning, soils, fire areas. As with John Snow, if you map things, it allows you to ask new kinds of questions. And I think the best example of this that really opened my eyes to a problem I hadn't really considered is this notion of food deserts. So there's been a lot of work mapping low-income communities with low access to nutritional foods. And not surprisingly, there's a close correlation with race and income. So this is a map I put up with the recent riots in Minneapolis in mind. Basically, darker areas show that you've got more access to, let's see. Yeah, so how far you have to walk. So harder access. You can do this yourself as well. The USDA, US Department of Agriculture, has a web tool called the Food Desert Locator. It's been renamed to the Food Access Research Atlas. So originally, because it's a Harvard talk, I wanted to show Cambridge, but Cambridge is now completely gentrified. So there is no food desert in Cambridge itself. So this is a map from New Haven, from Yale. And it basically shows low income, low access in these, I guess, green, yellow. I'm colorblind, so I'm going to guess they're green. So the color shading on this map. But there are other things we can do with maps now that we never could before also. We can look at the Earth in real time. So what do you think this is a map of? Right. It's lights, that's right. This is a map of the Earth at night. And it's lights, but lights are a proxy for energy, and energy is a proxy for wealth. Right? This is one very quick way of getting a sense of where the wealthy parts of the world. What does this say about most of Africa? What about this one? This is a tough one. I'll be impressed if folks know this. What is this a map of? Okay, Wi-Fi, close. Air routes, airplane, 5G satellite, it's close. It's Facebook. This is a map of Facebook use and connections. This is a map of human relations. And in many respects, it is a somewhat more optimistic or promising map, because Africa is much more light in the heart of Africa, center of Africa, than you see in the earlier simply energy use. So this doesn't represent rivers or borders, it's human relationships. And where we're moving to, you might remember that I said the most accurate map in the world is the world. I said you can't carry that in your back pocket. Well, it turns out you can, because of virtual reality. The entire Earth is now becoming a map where you literally can walk down a street in many parts of the United States, and I think it's not too long before it's going to be anywhere in the world. The entire Earth can become a map. And then finally, I think we can go from the globe to inside the cell, the human genome, visual data represented at the genetic level. I'll leave it to you to decide whether this counts as a 21st century map or not. It does to me. But it's whether you think of it as that or not, it shows the power of visual representation of data, which is really what maps are all about. And so to draw this to a close, maps are important because they can powerfully communicate different types of knowledge in ways that words and numbers could never achieve. They can show our physical position. They can show basic guides to get somewhere. They can show our metaphysical place. They're instrumental, whether for commerce, military, propaganda. They are complex data made comprehensible, and that is only going to increase in time. And so I leave you with a take-home message, which is the stories of maps tell the story of how the conception of our place in the world has changed and is changing. When we look at maps, we look at ourselves, and it's always been so. So very quickly, because I want to leave some time for questions, if you want to learn some more, Harvard has a terrific map collection. It's one of the largest in the world, over 500,000 items. A lot of it is online. They have terrific exhibitions that are all user-friendly. There are other places you can go for resources, some great books. If you email me, Piper's going to put up my email. I can tell you more about these. And I will end just with some blatant self-promotion. If you like the talk, you'll like the books. So as Piper mentioned, my book with Michael Heller, Mine, is coming out in March. You can pre-order it now, even for the holidays. But Piper, I've run to my time. So let me pass back over to you and see if we can get to some of the questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jim. We appreciate you spending your, oops, let's see here. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. We appreciate you spending your Tuesday afternoon with the Harvard alumni community. We're very grateful for your time and your insight. And I know we've gone about 5 minutes over, but let's transition to our Q&A portion of the program. Just a quick note that we received many pre-submitted questions, so we will get to as many as we can. If you did submit a question or a comment that we were unable to answer, as Jim just mentioned, you will see his email appear on our final slide, and he will happily respond to you over email. So please do feel free to connect with him. So let's take a look here. Our first question comes from Michael. And his question is, what's the latest on the Vinland map controversy?
So this is a very cool story. So as Piper said, I had some of these questions beforehand, so I had some visual aids. So very briefly, this is a map from the 1600s. And I'm sorry, so it was published in 1969. It was supposedly from much earlier, pre-Columbian. It was basically supposed to show that the continent of North America was discovered well before Columbus. And this was a huge source of controversy. It's stored at the Beinecke Library at Yale. Long story short, they did a study a few years ago and found that one of the pigments was from a 20th century chemical. And so if something's too good to be true in maps, it is too good to be true. There's another similar controversy that's brewing over a map that shows Antarctica long before anyone knew about it, although no one's proven that's a forgery yet.
Interesting. Thank you. Our next question comes from John. How could the rising of sea levels reshape global land masses by the end of the millennium?
The short answer is a lot. And you can do this yourself. So this is a very cool website. And it basically allows you to, if you can see on the upper left, there is a bar. And you can move the bar to increase or decrease sea level rise. And sea level rises, depending on which model you follow, could be anywhere from 1 foot to 8 feet, depending on ice shelves and such. But what it does is it basically shows what happens to the coastline as you raise sea level. And Florida is essentially unrecognizable. Much of North Carolina, unrecognizable. DC is underwater. may not be a good thing depending on your perspective, but there's a dramatic shift that's going to take place on the East Coast, and you can see it for yourself. It sort of brings home just how potent a threat sea level rise is.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Jim. So another question, we received a few of these, so I'm going to combine it into one. What makes a continent? Why is Australia a continent and not Greenland?
Right. Why do we park in a driveway and drive in a parkway? These are deep, deep questions. It turns out that there's a huge amount of debate, and there are a lot of definitions of what a continent is, and there's no consensus answer. The most widely accepted definition is a large, continuous, discrete mass of land, ideally separated by an expanse of water. That obviously doesn't work for Europe and Asia. It doesn't work for North and South America. Some argue that Greenland is not a continent because it's on the same continental shelf as North America. My view is it's happenstance. And in fact, depending on where you are, there's dispute over the actual number of continents. So in English-speaking countries and in China, it's accepted there are 7 continents. Some parts of the world, there are 6 continents. Europe and Asia are combined. In Russia, much of Russia, for example, thinks there are 6 continents. Much of Europe thinks there are 6 continents because North and South America are combined into the Americas. And so the short answer is it's historical happenstance, and the debate continues.
Interesting. Actually, that just reminded me how many people have been to all 7 continents. You can include that in your chat. Jim is one of them. Okay, so let's get to one final question here so we can wrap up on time. And this is an interesting one. How do people with visual disabilities access maps?
Yeah, huge question, right? And obviously, if you're blind or visually impaired, you can't see it. And so there's something called tactile maps. So this, if you look carefully, is South Kensington, near many of the museums. And you can see that the folks here, they're actually reading Braille and reading the map itself. It's the same concept as Braille. It's a tactile way of reading. Increasingly, there are maps that are narrative maps where you actually talk to the app and it talks back to you. And that helps, and those oftentimes are combined.
Oh, wow.
So I know we're short of time, so let me stop my share of the screen and hand it back to you.
Sure. Absolutely. Fabulous. Well, thank you again, Jim. This was wonderful. And as I said, there are many questions that we did not get to. So as you can see, Jim's email is listed there. So send all of your questions, your comments, your thoughts to him. And if you are so inclined, Jim will be leading a trip for us next fall. It is a Black Sea cruise, so we'll be happy to send you more information on that. But we're anxious to get back on the road, so hopefully by then we'll be ready to go. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Piper.